Some stories aren't meant to be told, but this one needs to be heard. It started with something small, something almost unnoticeable, until it wasn't. Before we uncover the truth, make sure you're subscribed for more unforgettable stories. And if you enjoy mysterious twists, drop A in the comments. Here's what happened.
A mafia boss stopped his car when he saw a little girl lying injured on the highway, and he ran to her without thinking twice. Stefan knelt on the cold asphalt and gently lifted Lily into his arms. The child was hurt and breathing with great difficulty. Stefan felt her tiny body trembling against his chest and realized she was trying to say something, but her voice was too weak to hear clearly, so he leaned his ear close to her lips and caught a faint, shaky whisper about a man in a black care. Stefan's heart clenched because the little girl's voice carried a fear he'd never seen in a child before. The kind of fear that came from something far worse than a simple accident. He looked around the deserted stretch of Pacific Coast Highway and felt a chill run down his spine when he noticed there was no other vehicle nearby. No skid marks or signs of collision, just this little girl lying on the road as if someone had deliberately abandoned her here. Stefan carefully removed his tailored black jacket and draped it over Lily's frail body. She was still shaking despite the warm California evening, and he held her small hand in his, trying to give her some sense of safety. "It's okay, sweetheart, you're safe now," he said with a steady voice full of concern while observing the scrapes on her knees and the bruises beginning to form on her elbows. Lily slowly opened her eyes and looked at Stefan with an intensity that was terrifying for such a young child. Her pupils dilated from fear or perhaps from pain, and she tried to sit up but her body wouldn't obey. Stefan held her tighter and felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders, because this child needed urgent help, and he couldn't just leave her here waiting for someone to show up. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911, but the call wouldn't connect. He looked at the screen and saw there was no signal on this part of the highway, so he put the phone away while quickly thinking about what to do. Lily squeezed his hand with surprising strength for someone so small and so hurt, and whispered something that made the blood in Stefan's veins turn to ice. "He's coming back," the little girl said with wide, tear-filled eyes. "He said he's taking me far away, and I'll never see my mommy again." Stefan felt his throat tighten and looked out at the empty highway, trying to understand what was happening here, because this wasn't a normal accident, but something far more serious and dangerous. He carefully lifted Lily and walked quickly toward his black Maybach, parked a few meters away with its hazard lights still flashing. He opened the back door and gently laid her down on the leather seat, using his jacket as a pillow and covering her with a blanket from the trunk. Lily grabbed his wrist again and pulled hard as if wanting him to stay closer, and Stefan leaned down to her eye level. "Please don't send me back to him," Lily begged with a broken voice and tear-soaked eyes. He said, "Mommy gave me away, and I'll never go home again." Those words exploded like a bomb in Stefan's chest. He felt rage rising in his throat, but he controlled his expression and gently stroked the little girl's hair. "No one's gonna hurt you while I'm here," he promised, looking straight into Lily's eyes with deadly seriousness. "You're safe now, little one, I swear it." If this story's touching your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. Now let's go back to that satisfying moment when Stefan made a decision that would change 3 lives forever. Stefan drove through the Los Angeles night as fast as he could, repeatedly checking the rearview mirror to make sure Lily was still there in the back seat. She'd fallen asleep, but her breathing was faint and uneven, and that only tightened the knot of worry in his chest. He didn't take her to a public hospital, because that would mean the police would get involved, and everything would become complicated before he even understood what was really happening. Instead, he called the private hospital Cedars-Sinai, where he knew the board, and he ordered them to prepare a private emergency room immediately. When the black Maybach tore into the VIP emergency entrance 20 minutes later, a medical team was already waiting with a gurney and equipment. Stefan lifted Lily out of the car and laid her on the gurney while the doctors began a preliminary check right away. He followed them inside with the quick, decisive stride of a man used to giving orders, not taking them. The head of the emergency department examined Lily personally after receiving Stefan's call, and he spent nearly an hour conducting a thorough evaluation of her condition. Stefan stood outside the exam room, watching through the glass with his arms folded across his chest and his jaw clenched tight as he waited for the results. When the doctor came out, he reported that Lily was dehydrated and showed signs of mild malnutrition, suggesting she hadn't been properly cared for some time. The scrapes on her knees and elbows were from falling on a hard surface like asphalt, not from being beaten, and that made Stefan breathe a little easier, even if only slightly. There were no signs of serious physical abuse, the doctor added, but this child had clearly been through a very severe psychological trauma. Stefan nodded and stepped into the room when the doctor allowed it. Lily was awake now, sitting on the hospital bed with wide, frightened eyes, scanning the unfamiliar room. When she saw Stefan come in, she flinched and drew in on herself. But then she recognized him as the man who'd saved her on the road, and her shoulders loosened as she looked at him with an expression that held both gratitude and worry. Stefan pulled up a chair beside the bed and lowered his voice, speaking to Lily in the gentlest tone he could manage, because he knew she was terrified. "Can you tell me what happened?" Stefan asked, and Lily stayed silent for a long time before she finally began to speak, her voice trembling. "My mom cried a lot," she said, and her eyes filled with tears. "She told me to go with him for a while, and then she'd come get me. He said I'd have a new family that was rich, and I'd have good food and pretty clothes, but I don't want a new family. I just want to be with my mom." Stefan felt anger start to boil up in his chest, but he kept his face calm so he wouldn't frighten Lily even more. "And then what, sweetheart?" he asked, and Lily kept going. "I sat in the car with him for a long time, and he talked on the phone with someone in a really strange voice. He said I was good merchandise, and he'd deliver on time. I got so scared, so when the car stopped at a red light, I opened the door, jumped out, and ran. I ran and ran and ran until I fell and I couldn't get up anymore." Stefan gripped the arm of the chair so hard his knuckles went white, because what she'd just said confirmed what he'd suspected from the beginning, that this was human trafficking, not some ordinary family matter. He asked Lily if she remembered her mother's name, and the girl nodded and said her mom's name was Faith. "Can you find my mom?" Lily asked, her eyes bright with hope, and Stefan didn't know how to answer because he didn't have enough information yet. At that moment, his phone buzzed, and the name Connor appeared on the screen. Stefan stepped out into the hallway to take the call, and Connor reported in a grave voice that he'd checked the entire missing persons reporting system over the past 48 hours, but there wasn't a single case that matched Lily's description. "Nobody reported her missing?" Stefan asked again, and Connor confirmed that no one had. Stefan fell silent for a long moment and looked through the glass into the hospital room, where Lily sat alone, clutching a stuffed bear a nurse had just given her. "Nobody's looking for this child," he said slowly, his voice cold as steel. "Or nobody dares to look." Stefan didn't waste another second after the call with Connor. He went back into the hospital room and told Lily to rest and that he'd be back soon, then stepped out and called Raymond Cruz, the best private investigator money could buy in Los Angeles. Raymond had worked for Stefan for years, and he understood that when his boss called at midnight, it was serious, and it couldn't wait until morning. Stefan gave a short, sharp order. "Find any information about a black SUV that had been on the Pacific Coast Highway tonight, and find a woman named Faith, who had a 6-year-old daughter named Lily." Raymond acknowledged it and started immediately, while Stefan returned to the hospital and sat on the sofa in the VIP waiting area, his eyes wide open through the entire night. The next morning, Connor came to the hospital with a laptop and a strained expression. He'd hacked into the city's traffic camera system and found a critical video from an intersection in Santa Monica. Stefan stared at the screen and saw it clearly. A black SUV stopped at a red light. The back door suddenly flew open, and a small figure leapt out, rolling across the pavement before struggling to get up and run. The vehicle tried to turn around, but another car blocked it from behind, forcing it to keep going when the light turned green. Stefan clenched his teeth as he watched the clip again and again, because he could see exactly how terrified that tiny girl had been when she risked her life jumping from a moving car. Connor zoomed in on the license plate and ran it through California's vehicle registration system. The result that appeared left both of them silent, because the SUV was owned by a company called Bright Future Family Services, registered as operating in the field of family services and child support. Stefan ordered Connor to dig deeper into the company, and within a few hours the full picture began to take shape. Bright Future Family Services was an organization founded 5 years earlier by a man named Grant Holloway, and on paper, it was a nonprofit that specialized in helping struggling single mothers by connecting them with wealthy families who wanted to adopt children temporarily or permanently. But as Connor dug deeper into the financial records and the suspicious transactions, it became clear that this was only a front for something far dirtier. Stefan stood and walked to the window, looking out at Los Angeles, washed in early morning sunlight, while his mind churned as the pieces began to lock into place. "Grant Holloway," he murmured, and suddenly he remembered. 5 years ago, a man named Grant had approached Stefan's empire, offering a partnership in a deal he'd called the transport of special cargo. Stefan had refused immediately, because his instincts told him there was something wrong about that man and about the so-called special cargo. He had an unbreakable rule in the underworld. He never got involved with women and children, and Grant Holloway smelled like exactly what Stefan hated most. Now Stefan understood why his instincts had warned him 5 years earlier. Grant Holloway wasn't a charitable businessman. He was a predator hiding behind kindness, hunting the children of desperate mothers who had nowhere else to turn. Connor asked Stefan what he wanted to do next, and Stefan turned back with eyes cold as ice. "Find me everything about Faith, Lily's mother," he ordered, "and find me Grant Holloway's address. He's been hiding behind Charity to hunt the children of desperate mothers, and I'm going to make him understand he just hunted the wrong prey." 48 hours before Lily ended up on the Pacific Coast Highway, Faith Morgan was sitting on a worn-out bed in a shabby apartment in East Los Angeles, staring at a hospital diagnosis sheet with trembling hands. A brain tumor at a stage that required urgent surgery within 2 months. An estimated cost of $200,000, and she didn't have health insurance. Faith set the paper down and looked around the cramped room where she'd lived with Lily for 6 years, ever since she'd given birth to her daughter alone in a public hospital with no one beside her. She'd been an orphan since childhood, raised in group homes, then adopted at 16. But that adoption wasn't a blessing. It was the beginning of a nightmare. At 19, she was raped by the adopted family's own son, and when she found out she was pregnant, she was thrown out onto the street like a stain of shame. Faith never told anyone who Lily's father was, because she wanted her daughter to never have to carry the weight of that past. She gave birth alone, she raised her child alone, and she fought her way through a brutal life alone for 6 years, working 3 jobs a day, waiting tables at a diner, cleaning office buildings at night, and selling flowers on the street on weekends. But now the brain tumor was stealing the last of her strength, and she didn't know what to do. A knock rattled the door, and when Faith opened it, her landlord stood there with a face like ice. He threatened that if Faith didn't pay 3 months of rent within a week, she and her daughter would be thrown out. Faith shut the door and leaned her back against the wall, eyes closed, forcing her tears down because she didn't want Lily to see her cry. Right then, the familiar headache crashed over her again, like someone was swinging a hammer inside her skull, and she had to grip the wall to keep from collapsing. Lily ran to her, wrapped her arms around her mother's legs, and looked up with worried eyes, asking if she was okay. And Faith tried to smile and said she was fine, not to worry. That afternoon, a man knocked on the apartment door and introduced himself as Grant Holloway from Bright Future Family Services, an organization that supported struggling single mothers. He was neatly dressed, soft-spoken, with the trustworthy look of a professional charity worker. Grant said his organization had heard about Faith's situation and wanted to help. He offered a program he called temporary care, in which Lily would be taken in by a wealthy family for 6 months, so Faith could have time to get treatment and stabilize her life. In return, Faith would receive $50,000 to pay for the surgery, and once she recovered, she could take Lily back at any time. Faith shook her head and refused immediately, because no matter how desperate she was, she'd never be separated from her daughter. Grant didn't give up. He kept persuading her in a honeyed voice, saying it was for Lily's future, and if Faith died because she couldn't afford surgery, who would take care of the girl? Those words cut into Faith's heart like a knife, but she still refused. Grant left a packet of paperwork and his business card, telling her to think it over and call him any time. Then he left. That night, Faith couldn't sleep because the headache kept growing worse, and she had to bite into her pillow so she wouldn't scream and wake Lily. The next morning, while she was making breakfast for Lily, the most horrific headache she'd ever felt slammed into her, and Faith crumpled onto the kitchen floor as everything went dark. Lily screamed for her mother and ran to shake her, her small hands trembling. "Mom, wake up! Mom, don't die! Mom!" Lily sobbed, and the sound of her daughter's crying pulled Faith back from the edge of the pain. She opened her eyes and saw Lily's face soaked in tears, staring at her with absolute terror. Faith gathered her child into her arms and felt that small body shaking with fear, and she realized that if she died, Lily would have no one left in the world. In the deepest pain and the most desperate hopelessness, Faith grabbed her phone and called Grant, and he arrived only 20 minutes later, as if he'd been waiting for this call. Grant placed the paperwork in front of Faith and handed her a pen with a warm smile, telling her she was doing the right thing for both their futures. Faith stared at the thick stack of documents, the tiny lines of print swimming because her eyes were blurred by pain and she couldn't read them clearly. She could only hear Lily still sniffling beside her, and she could feel the agony ripping through her head. In that moment, when her reason was smothered by pain and despair, Faith took the pen and signed the papers without reading a single word. Grant swiftly put the packet away and said he'd take Lily right now so Faith could rest and prepare for surgery. Faith held Lily one last time and promised her she'd come get her soon. Just a few months, sweetheart. Lily cried and didn't want to leave her mother, but Grant gently led the little girl out to the car, and Faith watched her daughter's small figure disappear through the window frame, not knowing what she'd just signed. She didn't know she'd just signed a death sentence for her own right to be a mother. Faith woke up that evening after slipping into sleep from exhaustion and the brutal headache, and the first thing she did was call Lily's name. The apartment was so silent it felt eerie, and Faith staggered to her feet and searched the whole place, but Lily was nowhere. She saw Grant's business card on the table and hurriedly dialed the number with trembling hands. An automated voice came on and said the number didn't exist, and Faith called again, then a second time, then a third, then a 10th, but it was always the same. She tore through the apartment looking for the packet of papers she'd signed, trying to find an office address for the organization, but Grant had taken everything, leaving no trace except that business card with a fake number. Faith ran out into the street in her wrinkled clothes and asked the neighbors if anyone had seen where Lily went, but no one knew anything. She called a taxi to the office address printed on the card in downtown, and when she got there, all she found was an empty building with no sign for Bright Future Family Services. The building guard told her no company by that name had ever rented an office there, and Faith stood frozen on the sidewalk as if struck by lightning. Everything had been a lie: the company name, the phone number, the office address, and she'd been foolish enough to believe a con man and hand her daughter over to him. Faith screamed in the middle of the crowded street, and passers-by stared at her like she was insane. But she didn't care, because the pain in her chest was more horrific than any headache the tumor had ever caused. She went back to the apartment and called the police to report her daughter missing. But when the officers asked for details, she realized she had nothing to prove anything. No contract, no address, no real phone number, and she couldn't even remember Grant's license plate clearly, because at the time she'd been in so much pain she couldn't focus on anything. The police took her statement, but Faith could see the suspicion in their eyes, the suspicion reserved for a mother who'd willingly handed her child to a stranger and was now reporting her missing. They promised they'd investigate, but Faith knew her case would be filed among hundreds of other missing person reports, and it might never be solved. That night, Faith curled up in the corner of the dark room, clutching Lily's photograph to her chest, and she cried until she had no tears left. She looked around and saw Lily's toys still lined up on the shelf, and the little pillow on the bed still held the shape of her daughter's head, and Lily's scent still lingered faintly in the air. Faith hugged that pillow and breathed in her child's smell while her body trembled with pain and guilt. She blamed herself for being weak, for being desperate, for being foolish enough to believe the promises of a stranger, and now her daughter was out there somewhere, alone and terrified, and she didn't even know where to start looking. In the days that followed, Faith didn't eat, didn't sleep, and didn't leave the apartment, because she was afraid that if she stepped outside, Lily would come back and not find her mother. She sat by the window staring out at the street with empty eyes, her hand still gripping Lily's photograph, as if it was the only thing keeping her alive. The tumor headaches grew worse and worse, but Faith didn't care about treatment anymore, because without Lily, what was she living for? She'd lost the only child she had in the world, and she didn't know where to find her. Raymond Cruz called Stefan the next morning with the information his boss had been waiting for. The investigator had found Faith Morgan's address in an apartment complex in East Los Angeles, and Stefan decided he'd go meet this woman in person. Connor objected fiercely, because that area wasn't safe for someone of Stefan's standing, and his boss getting personally involved in this could create all kinds of unpredictable trouble. But Stefan didn't listen, because he needed to see with his own eyes the mother who'd handed her daughter over to a trafficker, and he needed to know whether she was an accomplice or just another victim of Grant Holloway. The black Maybach stopped in front of a worn-down apartment building in East Los Angeles, and Stefan stepped out in a tailored black three-piece suit worth thousands of dollars, looking completely out of place in this poor neighborhood. He left Connor in the car and climbed the dim, damp-smelling stairs alone to the third floor, where Faith's unit sat at the end of the hallway. Stefan knocked, but no one answered, so he knocked harder and called out Faith Morgan. Still silence, and Stefan decided to open the door himself, because that old lock wasn't a challenge for a man like him. The door swung open, and Stefan stepped into a dark room with the curtains drawn tight, letting no light in. The air smelled stale, and the scent of someone who hadn't bathed in days made him frown, but he kept moving forward. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, and he saw a figure curled in the corner near the window. Faith sat there with tangled hair, wrinkled clothes, and swollen eyes from crying too much, her arms wrapped tight around a photograph pressed to her chest. She didn't realize anyone had entered until Stefan stood a few steps away and spoke. Faith Morgan. Faith jolted, looked up, and when she saw a stranger in an expensive suit standing inside her apartment, she immediately screamed in panic. "Get out of here!" Faith shrieked, trying to stand, but her body was too weak and she collapsed onto the floor. "You took my child, and now what do you want?" she shouted, her voice hoarse from too much crying, her terrified eyes fixed on Stefan like he was an enemy. She thought he was one of Grant's men, here to finish whatever was left undone. Stefan stayed where he was, not moving any closer, and said in a cold voice, "I have your daughter." Faith froze at those words, her eyes widening as a flicker of hope cut through the wreckage of her despair. "Lily," she whispered, and tears began to spill down her hollow cheeks. "Where is she? Is she okay? Please let me see her. Please." Faith crawled to Stefan and dropped to her knees, clutching his pant leg and begging in a choked voice. "Please, I'll do anything you want. Just let me see my daughter." Stefan looked down at the woman kneeling at his feet, and for the first time he truly studied the room around her. He saw painkiller bottles scattered everywhere, and hospital bills piled on the table with enormous numbers printed across them. He saw Lily's photographs taped all over the walls and every surface, as if this mother needed to see her child everywhere just to keep breathing. He saw an empty refrigerator and a sink full of dirty dishes from days ago, and he saw a woman so thin she was almost nothing but skin and bone, with sunken eyes and the pale, sickly complexion of someone seriously ill and uncared for. Stefan began to understand that this wasn't a heartless mother who'd abandoned her child, but a mother driven into a corner by illness, poverty, and desperation, then exploited by a predator who'd seized her at her weakest moment and stolen the only child she had. Faith was still kneeling and begging nonstop when she suddenly stopped speaking and lifted a hand to clutch her head, her face twisting in agony. The savage headache from the tumor crashed down, and she let out a scream before collapsing onto the floor unconscious. Stefan dropped to his knees at once to check her and saw she was still breathing, but her pulse was weak and irregular. He knew she needed medical care immediately, but he didn't want to take her to a public hospital, because that would bring the police and complicated questions he wasn't ready to answer. Stefan lifted Faith into his arms, startled by how light she was, as if she weighed nothing at all. He hurried down the stairs, and Connor opened the car door with a shocked expression when he saw his boss carrying a woman. "Back to the estate," Stefan ordered curtly, "and call Dr. Thorne to come immediately." The Maybach sped into the night, and Stefan looked down at the unconscious woman in his arms with a complicated feeling twisting inside him. Is she a victim or a criminal? He wondered, and he still hadn't decided. But there was one thing he knew for certain. She had answers to what had happened to Lily, and he'd find the truth at any cost. Faith opened her eyes and didn't recognize where she was, because the room around her was completely unfamiliar, and so luxurious she thought she had to be dreaming. The ceiling was high with a crystal chandelier, the walls were painted a pale cream with framed art hung everywhere, and she was lying on a modern hospital bed with all kinds of health monitoring machines arranged around her. A middle-aged woman in a white coat stood beside the bed, checking the readings on the screen, and when she saw Faith was awake, she turned with a professional smile. "I'm Dr. Helena Thorne," she said calmly, "and you're in Mr. Delacroix's estate in Beverly Hills." Faith tried to sit up, but her body was still weak, and Dr. Thorne gently helped her settle back against the pillows. "I've examined your condition," the doctor continued, "and the tumor in your brain is growing faster than expected. You need surgery within a few weeks, or the consequences will be very serious." Faith didn't care about the tumor or the surgery, because there was only one thing in her mind. "Lily," she said in a hoarse voice, "that man said he has my daughter." Before Dr. Thorne could answer, the door opened and Stefan walked in with a face like stone. He wore a black shirt with the sleeves rolled up, exposing solid forearms, and his gray eyes looked at Faith without a trace of emotion. "Let us talk alone," Stefan said to Dr. Thorne, and she nodded and left, closing the door behind her. Stefan pulled up a chair beside the bed, but he kept his distance from Faith, and he didn't speak. He only watched her with an appraising stare, as if she were a defendant in court. "Lily, is she okay?" Faith asked in a pleading voice. "Please tell me my baby is okay." Stefan stayed silent, and instead he tossed a stack of papers onto the bed in front of Faith. "Read it," he said flatly, and Faith picked up the papers with trembling hands. It was a typed contract on official letterhead, with a seal and notarized signatures, and as Faith began to read, the blood in her body seemed to freeze, little by little. This wasn't a temporary care agreement the way Grant had described it. It was a permanent, irrevocable transfer of parental rights. According to the contract, Faith Morgan had voluntarily relinquished all rights and responsibilities to the child named Lily Morgan, and transferred full custody to the receiving party, a name Faith didn't recognize at all. And at the bottom of the final page was her own signature, shaky and scrawled. From that day when she'd been in so much pain, she couldn't read a single word. Faith let the papers drop onto the bed and clapped a hand over her mouth as nausea rose with the horrific understanding of what she'd done. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice strangled. "I didn't know what it was. I thought it was just paperwork for the temporary care program. I never." Stefan cut her off in a cold voice without a shred of mercy. "You signed a permanent transfer of parental rights," he said slowly, each word deliberate so Faith would hear it clearly. "Legally, you're not that child's mother anymore." The words struck Faith like a knife through the chest, and she felt the world around her collapse completely. She wasn't Lily's mother anymore. She'd signed away her motherhood with her own hand without even knowing it, and now she had no claim to the child she'd carried, delivered, and loved more than her own life. Faith slid off the bed and dropped to her knees on the floor in front of Stefan, tears streaming down her pale face. "Please," she said in desperation. "I'll do anything you want. I'll be your slave for the rest of my life. I'll pay with my life if I have to. Just please let me see my child one time. Please let me see Lily." Stefan looked down at the woman kneeling at his feet, and for the first time something flickered in his cold eyes, even if only for a moment. He didn't say anything. He only stood and walked out of the room, leaving Faith alone with the papers and the brutal truth that she'd signed away her right to be a mother without knowing what she'd signed. Stefan sat in his study through that entire night, the stack of files Raymond Cruz had gathered on Faith Morgan spread across his desk. He read every page with the absolute focus of a man who'd spent his life dissecting people to find weakness and lies. But the more he read, the less he found anything suspicious, and the more he saw a story of a woman who'd fought alone against life for 27 years. Faith had no criminal record, and had never been involved in any illegal activity. What surprised Stefan was that she qualified for social assistance for low-income single mothers, but she'd never applied, because she was afraid the welfare system would judge her unfit to raise her child and take Lily away from her. Instead, she'd worked 3 jobs at the same time, 16 hours a day, to support her daughter on her own, without asking anyone for help. Her medical records showed she'd been living with tumor headaches for more than a year, but she hadn't gone to a doctor because she had no money and no insurance, not until the pain became unbearable. Stefan set the file down and opened his laptop to watch the video Connor had found from a security camera at a shop near Faith's apartment. The footage showed Grant Holloway coming to see Faith the second time on the morning she signed the papers. Stefan watched Faith collapse onto the floor, and Lily run to her, clinging to her mother and crying. He watched her try to get up, but the pain wouldn't let her, and Grant stood there waiting with the packet in his hand like a vulture hovering over exhausted prey. He watched Faith sign with eyes blurred by pain, her hands shaking so hard she could barely hold the pen. That wasn't a clear-minded mother making a decision. It was a sick woman pushed to the edge and exploited by a predator who'd used her weakest moment to steal the only child she had. Stefan closed the laptop and sat in the darkness for a long while, staring into nothing. A soft knock came at the door, and Mrs. Patricia Chen stepped in with a worried face. She'd been Stefan's housekeeper for more than 15 years, and she was the only woman he trusted like a mother, since his own mother had been killed. "Sir," she said gently, but with real concern, "little Lily won't eat anything. She keeps asking where her mom is, and she's been crying all night. I don't know what to do." Stefan was silent for a moment. Then he stood and walked out of the study with a decision already made in his head. He went to Faith's room and opened the door without knocking. Faith was sitting on the bed with eyes red from crying, and when she saw Stefan, she stood at once, her expression caught between fear and hope. Stefan said briefly, "I'll let you see your daughter, but there are conditions." Faith nodded over and over and said she'd do anything. "You and your daughter will stay in this estate under my supervision until I've handled everything," Stefan said in a voice that didn't allow argument. "You won't leave. You won't contact anyone outside, and you'll follow every rule I set. If you agree, I'll take you to Lily right now." Faith didn't need even a second to think, and she nodded, accepting everything, because seeing her child again was the only thing she'd been begging for. Stefan led Faith down the estate's long hallway and stopped in front of a white door decorated with painted butterflies. He opened it and stepped aside so Faith could see inside. Lily was sitting on the bed hugging a pillow, her eyes swollen from crying, and when she looked up and saw her mother standing in the doorway, her whole body went still. "Mom," Lily whispered, her voice barely holding the disbelief. She slid slowly off the bed and walked toward Faith, but she stopped a few steps away, her face a mixture of joy, confusion, and a lingering fear from what had happened. Faith sank to her knees so her face was level with her daughter's, and she opened her arms wide, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Lily, baby," she called, her voice breaking. "It's Mommy. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, sweetheart." Lily stood there for a brief moment, as if she was trying to process everything inside her, and then she burst into tears and ran into her mother's arms. "Mommy," Lily sobbed. "I missed you. I was so scared. I thought I'd never see you again." Faith held her daughter tight and cried without sound, stroking Lily's hair and kissing the top of her head again and again. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'll never leave you again. I promise. I promise you." Stefan stood in the doorway watching, and something in his chest tightened with a strange, sharp ache. He watched the mother and child holding each other and crying, and in that moment, an image of his own mother and his little sister from 20 years ago rose suddenly in his mind. He remembered the last time he'd seen his mother holding his sister before everything was ripped out of his hands forever. Stefan turned and walked away quickly from the door, because he didn't want anyone to see what was happening in his eyes right now. For the first time in 25 years, his frozen heart felt something, and he didn't know if it was something good or something dangerous. The night was late, and the estate lay in silence, but Stefan was still sitting alone in his study, a glass of whiskey long since empty in his hand. He didn't turn on the lights, letting the darkness cover the room, because sometimes the dark was the only friend that understood what was happening inside him. His hand reached for the hidden drawer beneath his desk and pulled out an old photograph, yellowed by time. In the picture, a beautiful woman with long black hair held a little girl of about 8, with wide eyes and an innocent smile. His mother and his sister, 25 years ago, when their life had still been peaceful and happy. Stefan traced the photograph gently, and the most painful memory of his life surged back like a wave he couldn't stop. He was 12 when it happened, on a bitter winter night in Chicago. His father was a low-level member of the local Mafia family, and he'd accidentally witnessed a deal that no one was supposed to know about. They came at midnight while the whole house was asleep, and Stefan was locked in a closet by his mother, who used her own body to shield her son before she was shot dead right in front of him through the crack in the closet door. His sister, 8 years old at the time, was dragged away, and that was the last time he ever saw her. The police never found her, even after searching for years, and Stefan grew up with grief and a burning hatred inside him. He spent his entire life building his own empire in the underworld, not because he loved power, but because he needed strength, so he'd never have to be helpless the way he'd been that night again. And he set one unbreakable rule for himself and for everyone under his command. No one ever touched women and children, because he knew what it felt like to lose a mother and lose a sister, and how that kind of pain never truly leaves you. Stefan looked at the photograph and understood why he couldn't leave Lily on that road, because she looked like his sister in a way that hurt. The same curly brown hair, the same wide eyes filled with fear, and the same age his sister had been when she was taken. When he looked at Lily, he saw his sister, and he couldn't let history repeat itself. A soft knock came at the door, and Connor stepped into the study with a serious face. He saw the photograph in Stefan's hand, but he didn't say anything, because he was one of the few people who knew his boss's past. "I have news about Grant Holloway," Connor said, sitting down in the chair across from him. "He's panicking because he knows Lily disappeared, and he doesn't dare call the police because he's afraid he'll be exposed. He's trying to contact his partner in Las Vegas to figure out how to handle it." Stefan set the photograph down on the desk and looked at Connor with eyes like ice. He'll pay, Stefan said slowly, his voice empty of emotion but carrying a lethal promise. But he'll pay my way. I want him to know who I am, and I want him to be afraid before he loses everything. Connor nodded, understanding, and asked Stefan where he wanted to start. Stefan stood and walked to the window, staring out at the dark garden beyond. I'll contact the other bosses, he said, and I'll tell them Grant broke the rules of our world. When no one's left to shield him, I'll go see him myself. Connor stood to leave, but he paused at the door and turned back to look at Stefan. Why do you care about this so much? He asked with real curiosity. This isn't our problem. Stefan didn't turn around, and his voice dropped when he answered. 25 years ago, I couldn't save my sister. This time will be different. Grant Holloway sat in his hidden office in the industrial district of South Los Angeles, cold sweat running down his spine even though the air conditioning was blasting at full power. One of his men had just delivered news that nearly stopped his breathing, because the child he'd been hunting for days was in the hands of Stefan Delacroix, the most notorious mafia boss on the west coast of the United States. The man had been watching Cedars-Sinai since their mole in the hospital's logistics department flagged a high priority, private emergency entry matching the girl's description. Grant knew Stefan's reputation in the underworld, because Stefan was the man who'd refused to work with him 5 years ago, saying he didn't touch dirty business, and now Grant understood exactly why Stefan despised him so deeply. Grant's phone vibrated, and he picked it up with shaking hands when he saw the call was coming from Las Vegas. On the other end was the voice, cold as ice, of a representative for the organization that had ordered Lily, and they weren't pleased to hear the merchandise had been lost. We paid up front, the voice growled, and we want the child or we want our money back within 1 week. If you can't do it, don't blame us for not warning you. Grant ended the call and felt like he was caught between two crushing jaws, because on one side was the criminal organization in Las Vegas demanding repayment, and on the other side was Stefan Delacroix holding what Grant needed. In desperation, Grant decided to gamble by sending people to watch Stefan's estate and find a way to reach Faith from the inside, because he knew that if he could pull the mother back into his grasp, he might be able to get the child back. He had someone send a message to the phone Faith was using, posing as a hospital staff member who needed her to come sign important paperwork related to her medical file. But Grant didn't know Connor had men monitoring every line of communication in and out of the estate, and the message was intercepted immediately. Not only that, Stefan's security team also noticed a strange vehicle parked near the estate for hours, and they moved quietly, captured the man inside, and took him to an abandoned warehouse for questioning. Stefan went to the warehouse himself, and it took only 15 minutes before the man spilled everything, from Grant's plan to information about the Las Vegas organization, to a list of other children who'd already been sold through that pipeline. Stefan logged it all, then ordered Connor to deal with the man in a way that would ensure he'd never be able to tell anyone what he'd seen. After that, Stefan began executing the plan he'd set in motion the night before. He contacted each powerful mafia boss on the West Coast privately, from San Francisco to San Diego, and he gave them evidence of Grant Holloway's operation. In the underworld, there were unwritten rules, and anyone who broke them was punished. And one of the most important rules was that you didn't get involved in trafficking children, because that was the lowest kind of filth that even criminals didn't accept. Stefan laid out proof that Grant had been hiding behind a charity front to trick desperate mothers into signing away their children, then transferring those children to other criminal groups. One boss after another reacted with fury, and agreed to Stefan's proposal to strip Grant of every layer of protection in their world. That meant no one was allowed to do business with him, no one was allowed to shield him, and if anything happened to him, no one was allowed to intervene. Grant Holloway was now a lone piece of prey in a pack of wolves, with nowhere left to hide. That night, Stefan called Grant's private, untraceable line discovered by Connor, and Grant answered with a trembling voice the moment he realized his secret contact had been breached. "Stefan Delacroix," Grant said, trying to sound steady, but his voice betrayed his fear. "We can talk like civilized men." Stefan gave a dry, humorless laugh on the other end, and his voice turned as cold as a Chicago winter, the city that had raised him. "I don't talk to men like you," he said slowly, each word measured. "I'm only calling to tell you one thing. I've spoken to everyone you thought would protect you, and they all agree you don't deserve to exist in this world anymore. No one's protecting you, no one's doing business with you, and no one's going to lift a finger when I come for you." Grant went silent, and Stefan could hear his ragged breathing through the line. "Run," Stefan said, almost a whisper, but soaked in menace. Run far, and pray I don't find you. But you and I both know that no matter where you run, I'll find you. He ended the call and stared out the window with the eyes of a hunter preparing to step into the chase. Grant Holloway was prey with nowhere to turn, and it was only a matter of time before justice was carried out. Faith's surgery day arrived on a bright, sun-filled morning in Los Angeles, and the entire estate seemed to tighten with the pulse of the operation about to begin. Dr. Helena Thorne had prepared everything in a private operating room inside the estate, with a professional medical team Stefan had hired from top hospitals, and they made sure Faith would receive the best care possible. Faith was taken to the prep room, and she tried to look calm, but her trembling hands betrayed the fear inside her. Lily clung to her mother and sobbed, refusing to let go, even though Mrs. Patricia had tried every way she could think of to soothe the child. "I don't want Mommy to go," Lily cried, tears streaming down her face. "If you go and don't come back, what am I going to do?" Faith held her daughter and fought to hold back her own tears, because she knew if she cried, Lily would be even more frightened. "I'll come back," she whispered into her daughter's ear. "I promise you, I'll come back." But Lily still wouldn't release her, and the sound of her crying echoed through the hallway in a way that broke anyone who heard it. Stefan was standing at the far end of the corridor, watching, and when he saw the situation couldn't be solved, he walked closer. He sat down beside Lily and looked at her with gray eyes that had lost some of their usual coldness. "Lily," Stefan said gently, and the little girl lifted her head to look at him with swollen, red-rimmed eyes. "Can I tell you a story?" Lily didn't speak. She only stared at Stefan, curious and still drowning in tears. Stefan sat on the floor so his face was level with hers, and he began in a low, gentle voice. "Once there was a boy who was 12, and he was also very afraid of losing his mother and his little sister," Stefan said, and Lily stayed quiet, listening. "That boy loved his mother and sister more than anything in the world, and he always believed he'd protect them forever. But then one day something bad happened, and the boy couldn't do anything." Lily looked at Stefan with wide eyes and asked, "Then what happened, Uncle?" Stefan was silent for a moment before he continued. "That boy grew up and became very strong, so he'd never be helpless like that again. And now that boy is a grown man, and he's going to make sure your mother comes back to you healthy. Do you believe me?" Lily stared deep into Stefan's eyes, as if searching for the truth there. And then she asked a question that made Stefan feel like his heart was being squeezed tight. "Did you lose your mom and your sister too, Uncle?" Stefan didn't answer with words. He only nodded slightly, and Lily reached out and suddenly took his large hand in her small one. "I'm not going to cry anymore," she said, her voice still shaking, "because I want to be strong like you." Faith watched that scene from the doorway of the prep room, and for the first time, she saw a completely different side of the man she'd believed was cold and ruthless. She was taken into surgery, and the door closed behind her, while Lily sat beside Stefan holding his hand. The operation lasted 8 hours, and through all that time, Stefan didn't leave the hallway for even a minute. Connor came with a report that there were important meetings that needed his boss, but Stefan waved him off and said cancel everything. Connor looked at his boss with undisguised shock, because in 10 years working for Stefan, he'd never seen him set work aside for anyone. Lily fell asleep on the sofa, with her head resting against Stefan's shoulder, and he sat perfectly still, afraid to wake her. He studied Lily's innocent face in sleep, and saw the image of his sister from 20 years ago. "Not this time," he told himself. "This time, I'll protect them at any cost." At last the operating room doors opened, and Dr. Thorne came out with a smile on her face. "The surgery was a success," she said, and Stefan felt as if a 1,000-pound stone had been lifted from his chest. "The tumor was removed completely, and she'll need time to recover, but the prognosis is very good." Stefan woke Lily and told her mommy was out of surgery and everything was okay. Lily opened her eyes, and when she heard that, she started to cry, but this time it was happy tears. When Faith woke up a few hours later, the first thing she asked, her voice rough from anesthesia, was where Lily was. Mrs. Patricia brought Lily into the room, and the little girl ran to the bed, climbed up, and wrapped herself around Faith as if she was afraid her mother would vanish. "Mommy, you're back," Lily cried, and Faith held her daughter with tears running down her cheeks. "I'm back, baby," she whispered. "I told you. I'll never leave you." Stefan stood outside the glass, watching the mother and child hold each other, and for a brief moment, a rare smile touched his lips, so rare that even Connor, standing beside him, was stunned. because in 10 years he'd almost never seen his boss smile. Faith suddenly looked toward the glass and caught Stefan's gaze. For the first time since she'd met him, she saw something warm in those cold gray eyes, and she understood that this man had saved her daughter, and now he'd just saved her too. Faith didn't know how she could ever repay a debt like this, but she knew she'd never forget what Stefan had done for her and her child. 2 weeks passed after the surgery, and Faith slowly recovered inside Stefan's lavish estate in Beverly Hills. The incision was healing, and the brutal headaches no longer tormented her. But what shocked Faith most wasn't her body coming back to life. It was the shift in the way she saw the man who'd saved both her and her daughter. Stefan was still cold and intimidating to everyone, from his guards to the men he did business with in the underworld. But with Lily, he was entirely different. Somehow, without her even noticing when it happened, Lily had grown attached to Uncle Stefan, and every night she insisted he had to come read her a story before she fell asleep. Faith had watched Stefan sit by Lily's bed with a fairy tale book in his hands, his deep voice warm as he spoke about princesses and knights, while Lily listened with shining eyes. It was an image Faith never thought she'd see from the most ruthless, infamous Mafia boss on the West Coast. Late at night, when the entire estate had fallen asleep, Faith often couldn't sleep because her mind was crowded with too many thoughts, and she'd go out to the balcony to sit beneath the Los Angeles night sky. And many times she found Stefan there too, whiskey in his hand, his eyes fixed on the darkness as if it held answers he'd never say out loud. At first, they only sat in silence beside each other, but slowly conversations began to form, starting with small questions about Faith's health, then growing into longer stories about life. One night, Faith told Stefan about her past, the first time she'd ever told anyone the full truth. She spoke about an orphan childhood in group homes, about being adopted and then raped by the adopted family's son when she was only 19, about being thrown out onto the street when they discovered she was pregnant, and about the years of giving birth alone and raising her child alone through poverty and despair. Stefan listened without saying a word, without judging, without showing pity. He only listened with absolute focus, as if her story was the most important thing in the world. Faith didn't know that this was the first time in Stefan's life he'd listened to someone talk about their pain without feeling the urge to walk away. Because he'd built a wall around his heart for so long, he'd convinced himself he couldn't feel anymore. But this woman and her little girl were slowly breaking that wall, brick by brick, and he couldn't stop it. One night, Lily's scream tore through the estate's silence, and both Stefan and Faith jolted awake and ran toward her room. They arrived at the same time and found Lily sitting up in bed, sobbing hard, her face drenched with tears and sweat. Faith sat down and pulled her daughter into her arms and asked what was wrong, what she'd dreamed about. Through her crying, Lily said she dreamed a bad man came to take her, and she called for Mommy, but Mommy couldn't hear. Then she lifted her head and looked at Stefan standing in the doorway and added, "But then Uncle Stefan came, and he saved me and Mommy. He chased the bad man away, and he hugged me and Mommy." Stefan stepped into the room and sat down on the other side of Lily's bed, and Lily immediately reached out, wrapping both arms around him too, pulling him closer. "I want you here with me and Mommy," Lily begged. "I don't want the bad man to come back anymore." Stefan and Faith looked at each other over Lily's head, and neither of them spoke, but they both understood the child needed them beside her right now. They stayed there on both sides of the bed, Lily in the middle holding both their hands, and little by little she calmed, then drifted off into a peaceful sleep. Faith felt her shoulder brush Stefan's as they both leaned down to watch Lily sleep, and she didn't pull away, because for some reason she didn't want to. Stefan felt that contact too, and his heart began to beat faster in a rhythm he couldn't control. He looked at Faith in the soft glow of the nightlight and saw her as strangely beautiful, her hair loose over her shoulders, her gentle eyes fixed on their daughter. Suddenly Stefan stood and left the room so quickly. Faith didn't have time to say anything. He went straight to his study, closed the door, and leaned back against the wall with his heart pounding out of control. Stefan Delacroix, the Mafia boss who wasn't afraid of any enemy in the world, was terrified now, because he realized he was being threatened by something more dangerous than every enemy combined. His own feelings. He'd built a wall around his heart for 20 years, and now that woman and her little girl were breaking it apart, and he didn't know what to do to stop them, or whether he truly wanted to stop them at all. Raymond Cruz called Stefan early that morning, with information that made everything far more complicated. The investigator had dug into Grant Holloway's network of connections and uncovered a name that even Stefan didn't expect. Los Angeles Deputy Mayor Richard Bennett was the one protecting Grant's pipeline, and he'd taken money from the organization in Las Vegas to shield an interstate trafficking operation running from California to Nevada. That explained why Grant had been able to operate openly for years under the cover of a charity without anyone touching him. And it also meant this case was big enough for the FBI to get involved because of the federal element. Stefan hadn't even had time to process that information when his phone buzzed with a call from his personal attorney, saying the Los Angeles Police Department had opened an investigation into Stefan's business activities and he was being summoned to the station that afternoon. Stefan understood immediately that this was Deputy Mayor Bennett's counterstrike, because Bennett must have learned Stefan was closing in on Grant, and he wanted to use his power to apply pressure in the other direction. Stefan called Connor in and ordered him to stay at the estate to protect Faith and Lily, while Stefan went to deal with the police, because he didn't trust leaving the two of them alone in a situation like this. Connor nodded, but the moment Stefan left, a coordinated crisis at their San Francisco office, carefully orchestrated by Bennett's allies, forced Connor to handle the situation remotely from the security hub, leaving the perimeter in the hands of the assigned guards. It was a mistake Connor would regret for the rest of his life, because Grant Holloway had been waiting for this chance for days. He knew he had no way out. The Las Vegas organization was demanding repayment, and Stefan was hunting him. So he decided to gamble on one final, desperate move. Grant had leveraged a plant inside the security firm that managed the estate's technical infrastructure, using a compromised technician who had worked on the systems for years. That traitor shut down the alarm system at the back gate and opened the way for Grant to slip into the estate in the middle of the afternoon, when Faith and Lily were in the living room. Faith was reading to Lily when the door suddenly opened, and she went rigid when she saw the face of the man who'd stolen her daughter standing right in front of her. Grant walked in with a gun in his hand and a twisted smile on his mouth. "Hello, Faith," he said in a voice she'd never forget. "We meet again." Lily screamed when she recognized the bad man from her nightmares, and Faith rose at once, stepping in front of her daughter with the raw, protective instinct of a mother. "What do you want?" Faith asked, her voice shaking, fighting to stay calm. Grant moved closer and said, "I want the kid, because I promised delivery, and I can't break my word. You hand her to me quietly, or I'll shoot you and take her anyway." Faith shook her head and said, "You'll have to step over my dead body." Grant gave a cold laugh and grabbed Faith by the hair, yanking hard while his other hand kept the gun trained on her. "Don't play hero," he snarled. "I don't have time for this." Faith fought back and screamed for help, and Grant got furious and slapped her so hard she fell to the floor, her cheek bruising, blood seeping at the corner of her mouth. Lily screamed and ran to her mother, wrapping her arms around her, while Grant lunged in to grab the child. At that moment, Mrs. Patricia heard the noise and triggered the emergency alarm button in the kitchen, sending a direct signal to Connor's phone. Connor was on his way back to the estate, and when he got the alert, he floored the gas and drove at maximum speed. Only 5 minutes later, he stormed into the living room with a gun in his hand and saw Grant trying to pull Lily out of Faith's arms. Connor didn't say a word. He fired straight into Grant's leg, and Grant howled and collapsed onto the floor. The security team rushed in right behind him and restrained Grant, while Connor ran to check Faith and Lily. Both of them were shaking, but neither was badly hurt, except for the bruise on Faith's face. Stefan got back to the estate 20 minutes after Connor's call, and the sight he walked into made his blood boil. Faith sat on the sofa with a bruised face and eyes still wet with tears, holding Lily tight in her arms. The little girl was still crying and trembling nonstop. Stefan walked over and dropped to his knees in front of them. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to say, because rage was choking his throat. He gently touched Faith's bruised cheek, and she looked at him with eyes that held fear and relief all at once, because he was home. Stefan stood and turned to look at Grant, cuffed and lying on the floor with a gunshot wound in his leg. Stefan's gaze was so cold that even Connor shivered, because in 10 years of working for Stefan, he'd never seen his boss look this terrifying. "Take him to the warehouse," Stefan said, his voice empty of emotion but packed with lethal fury. "I'll be there after." Grant had touched what no one was allowed to touch, and he was going to pay for it with everything he had. The abandoned warehouse in the industrial district of South Los Angeles was where people who betrayed Stefan were usually taken, and very few ever walked out of there intact. Grant Holloway sat on a metal chair in the middle of the empty room, his hands cuffed behind his back, his leg wound still seeping blood that soaked his pant leg red. He watched Stefan step in with eyes full of fear, because he knew this man's reputation in the underworld, and he knew he wouldn't get a second chance. Stefan pulled up a chair across from Grant and looked at him with eyes cold as ice, without a flicker of emotion. "You've got two choices," Stefan said slowly. "One, you tell me everything, and I'll hand you to the police so you've got a chance to live in prison. Two, you stay silent, and I'll show you why they call me Delacroix of the Dark." Grant swallowed hard and knew he had no choice but to cooperate, because he'd seen what Stefan's men could do to someone who refused to talk. He started confessing from beginning to end about the pipeline he'd built over 5 years, from how he approached desperate single mothers to how he tricked them into signing permanent custody transfer contracts, then moved the children to other criminal organizations. Grant gave the names of every accomplice, including the attorney who drafted the fraudulent contracts, the notary who stamped them illegally, and the transporters who moved children across state lines. He provided a full list of mothers who'd been deceived, including more than 20 cases in the past year alone, and the addresses of where some of the children had been taken. Most important of all, Grant admitted the involvement of Deputy Mayor Richard Bennett, who'd taken money to protect the pipeline and block any investigation aimed at Bright Future Family Services. Stefan recorded every detail and ordered Connor to film Grant's confession as evidence. After he had everything he needed, Stefan called someone he hadn't contacted in years. James Whitmore was Stefan's childhood friend from the days in Chicago before the tragedy, before their lives split into two completely different paths. James became a detective while Stefan became a mafia boss, but there was still a bond between them from years ago, when Stefan had saved James's life during a gang hit. James owed Stefan his life, and Stefan had never collected that debt until today. 2 hours later, James arrived at the warehouse, and Stefan handed him all the evidence, including Grant's recorded confession, the documentation about the trafficking operation, and most of all, the proof of Deputy Mayor Bennett's involvement. James reviewed it all and understood this case was too big for local law enforcement to handle alone, because it involved interstate operations from California to Nevada, and it needed the FBI. He promised Stefan he'd make sure everything was handled properly, and that the guilty would pay. Stefan nodded and walked out of the warehouse, leaving Grant for the police, because he'd done his part. 3 days later, the FBI officially opened an investigation into the interstate trafficking ring, and Grant Holloway was arrested on a long list of charges, from child trafficking to fraud and aggravated assault. His attorney said he was facing a sentence of 25 years to life, if convicted on all counts. Deputy Mayor Richard Bennett resigned the moment news of the investigation spread, and he was indicted for bribery and aiding and abetting human trafficking. The Bright Future Family Services pipeline was dismantled completely, and every accomplice was taken into custody. The FBI contacted the mothers on the list Grant had provided, and some children were rescued from the places they'd been taken to. The news spread across Los Angeles, and people talked about justice being served for innocent children and desperate mothers who'd been deceived. But no one knew that behind it all was a mafia boss who'd quietly used his power to bring down an entire criminal pipeline, all because of one little girl he'd found on the highway on a fateful night. Stefan sat in his study reading the news about the arrests, and he knew justice had been served, but deep inside he still had one thing left undone, something more important than anything he'd ever done before, and he knew he couldn't delay it any longer. Stefan got back to the estate at dawn, when the Los Angeles sky was shifting from black to the pale gray of morning. He stepped into the living room and was surprised to find Faith sitting on the sofa, waiting, even though it was so late. She stood when she saw him, and they looked at each other in silence for a long moment before Faith walked closer and did something no one would have expected. She hugged him. "Thank you for everything," Faith whispered against his chest. "Thank you for saving Lily. Thank you for saving me. And thank you for bringing us justice." Stefan went rigid, like stone, for a few seconds, because no one had held him like that since his mother died 25 years ago. Then slowly, like a wall collapsing, he wrapped his arms around Faith and felt her warmth seep into the cold places inside him. They stood like that for a long time in the dim light of dawn, and Stefan realized this was the moment he'd been waiting for 25 years, without even knowing it. That night, the full moon hung bright over Los Angeles, and Stefan led Faith up to the estate's rooftop, where they could see the entire city glittering with lights below. They sat beside each other on a long lounge chair, and for the first time in his life, Stefan told someone the whole truth about his past. He spoke about his mother, the woman who'd used her body to shield him before she was shot dead right in front of his eyes. He spoke about his 8-year-old sister, taken that night and never found again. He spoke about the 12-year-old boy who'd watched it all and grown up with pain and a burning hatred inside him. He spoke about the 25 years he'd spent building an empire in the shadows and building a wall around his heart so he'd never have to feel that kind of loss again. Faith listened without a word, and when Stefan finished, she gently took his hand and laced her fingers through his. "I can't replace the people you lost," she said softly, "and I know that pain will never completely disappear, but I can be here with you from now on, if you'll allow it. Lily and I can be your new family." Stefan looked at Faith in the moonlight and saw her as breathtakingly beautiful, her deep brown eyes fixed on him with pure honesty and love. He leaned down and kissed her, the first time in his life he'd kissed someone not out of desire, but out of real love. The kiss was gentle and sweet, like a promise of a new future. Just then, small footsteps sounded behind them, and they both turned to see Lily standing at the rooftop doorway, sleepy-eyed. "I can't sleep," she said, "and I came to find Mommy with Uncle Stefan." Then, she saw her mother and Uncle Stefan holding each other, and a radiant smile bloomed across her small face. She ran forward and threw her arms around both of them at once. "We're a family now, aren't we?" Lily asked brightly, and neither Stefan nor Faith could stop smiling as they looked down at her. "Yes," Stefan said, pulling both mother and daughter close. "We're a family." 1 year later, Stefan's estate wasn't a cold, silent place anymore. It was filled with Lily's laughter and the warmth of a real family. Stefan had established a charitable fund called Hope Foundation, dedicated to protecting women and children who'd been abused, financed by his own empire. Faith had become the foundation's director, and she used her own painful experience to help other mothers trapped in similar situations. Lily attended one of the best private schools in Los Angeles, and she'd become a carefree, joyful child again, no longer haunted by nightmares every night. On a beautiful Sunday, the three of them went on a picnic in Griffith Park with the golden retriever they'd adopted a few months earlier. Lily ran across the green grass with the dog, while Stefan and Faith sat on a blanket watching her with happy smiles. "Did you ever think life would look like this?" Faith asked, resting her head on Stefan's shoulder. Stefan looked at her, then at Lily laughing with the dog, and he shook his head. "No," he said. "And I never thought I'd have a family, or anyone who truly loved me, but that's why this is the best thing that's ever happened to me. Because I didn't expect it, it's even more precious." Stefan looked up at the blue California sky and remembered that fateful night on the Pacific Coast Highway when he saw a small figure lying by the roadside. He could have driven past like everyone else. He could have called the police and continued his life. But he stopped. That decision, made in just a few seconds, changed 3 lives forever. It gave Lily a safe, loving family. It gave Faith a second chance to live and to be a mother. And it gave Stefan what he thought he'd lost forever 25 years ago, a family to love and to be loved. Sometimes the darkness isn't the enemy. Sometimes, from the deepest darkness, we find the light of our lives. This story teaches us that life can push us into dead ends that feel impossible to escape. But there are always sparks of hope that appear where we least expect them. It reminds us to never judge someone by appearances, because behind a cold mafia boss can be a shattered heart waiting to be healed, and behind a mother who made a mistake can be a boundless love for her child. Most of all, this story shows the power of compassion and how pausing to help someone can change not only their life, but our own. How do you feel about this story? And did it make you think of anything in real life? We'd really love to hear what you feel deep in your heart, so please leave a comment below and share your thoughts. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and share this video with the people you love to spread the message of love and hope. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the moving stories we bring you every day. We sincerely thank you for taking the time to watch and for staying with this story. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.